England's interest in the colonies are not just in the 13 colonies. They want to expand westward. Problem with that is you have French colonies in North America, and you have Spanish colonies even further westward over in the west coast. But the expansion possibly westward from the English settlers trying to cross the Appalachian Mountains, and some of those French colonists who were up in kind of the Ohio Valley and Canadian region wanting to expand southward, is going to create a conflict. The French and Indian War is going to take place where it's not between the French and the Indians. So the cause of the war, which I just explained to you, you need to know, is that England and their colonies in North America and France and their colonies in North America are going to kind of come into a conflict in what's called the Ohio Valley. The Ohio Valley was a region both French colonists and English colonists wanted to inhabit. It's also a region that France was making a lot of money off of beaver trade with Huron Native Americans. The Huron would basically slay beavers, and they would cut the beaver pelts, and they would sell them to the French. They would trade them to the French. The French would trade in return, maybe iron weapons, maybe things that were made out of iron that the French didn't have, that the Huron didn't have access to. And so that kind of trade network in the Ohio Valley, where the French and the Huron Native Americans were having a nice symbiotic trade network, there wasn't kind of the difficult relationship that the English colonies had with Native Americans. That's something that the colonists wanted. They wanted a chance to go to the Ohio Valley. They wanted some of that beaver trade as well. And so as a result of that, you're going to get the French and Indian War. So now you know the cause of the French and Indian War. You also know a little bit about who was involved. So it was the French in the Ohio Valley, plus it was the English wanting to go toward the Ohio Valley. Essentially, the English colonists and England were on the same side in this war, in the French and Indian War. And the enemy, from the English and colonists' perspective, is the French and the Huron. The Huron are going to side with the French. So if the Huron are going to side with the French and they're going to have Native Americans fighting alongside the French, the English and the English colonists might want to recruit some Native Americans to fight with them, and they're going to get the Iroquois Confederacy to fight with them as well. So it's a complicated war in terms of who was involved. You have the French, you have the Huron Native Americans, and you have the English, and you have the English colonists, and you have the Iroquois Confederacy, all fighting in North America, primarily fighting in the Ohio River Valley area, the Mississippi area, and also in Canada. As it turns out, England is going to lose some of those first battles. The war is going to actually start with George Washington, a very young man, fighting in the Ohio Valley on behalf of England and the English colonies, actually as a member of the Virginia militia. And that battle at Fort Necessity is going to be a victory for the French, and it's going to be a defeat for the English colonies, particularly the Virginia militia, led by George Washington. The next battle that kind of is a loss that's a biggie is the Battle of Fort Duquesne, where France wins again. England loses, the colonies lose. And so France is kind of getting the better of England and the 13 colonies in the beginning of the French and Indian War. It's going to change, though, when William Pitt sends money over to the 13 colonies to North America as Secretary of State in England and changes the fortunes, of the French and Indian War, where now you have lots of money, lots of resources, lots of soldiers being poured into North America to help the English colonies and help England in the French and Indian War. So eventually the English are going to win the French and Indian War, and the final battle, the Battle of Fort Quebec, is going to be a victory for England. England's also going to get back Fort Duquesne, and France is going to have to admit defeat and wave the white flag. That's going to cause French colonists to have to kind of retreat out of North America, and that whole Ohio Valley area is now going to belong to England. And you would think the 13 colonists, right? The 13 colonies, they're going to get the Ohio Valley as well, but they don't. You see, the Native Americans were part of the French Indian War. Remember them? Remember the Huron natives, and you had the Iroquois Confederacy? Well, many Native Americans that were still in the Ohio Valley were not accepting defeat that easily. Particularly a very strong and charismatic chief named Chief Pontiac. He is not going to give up. He's not going to leave the Ohio Valley. In fact, he's going to fight back. He's going to lead some battles, and he's going to get a lot of other Native American tribes to form alliances with one another and to continue to fight in the Ohio country and what's western Pennsylvania now. And so eventually England has to take British regulars and throw them at the Ohio Valley, even though technically the French Indian War has ended in terms of the French retreat and the French defeat and the Treaty of Paris already being signed. But Chief Pontiac won't give up. So England's got to send the British regulars to deal with the skirmishes between the colonists who are coming into the Ohio Valley and Chief Pontiac and all of his Native American alliances. As a result of that, England's going to set a boundary line along the 13 colonies, going north to south, right along the Appalachian Mountains. And it's basically going to be saying to the colonists, you cannot settle across the Appalachian Mountains over west into the Ohio Valley. That land belongs to us because you're getting in too many battles with the Native Americans, and it's causing us to have to expend resources. And we've already spent a lot of money on the French and Indian War in your behalf in North America. In fact, England is going to be in tremendous debt because of the French and Indian War. And they're kind of going to blame that debt on the colonists and them saying that they were sort of fighting for the colonists in North America. So the colonists are not appreciating the fact that they can't settle in the Ohio Valley. They feel like they just helped England fight in the French and Indian War. And they feel like that Ohio country, that Ohio Valley area, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, the Great Lakes region, should be open to settlement for the colonists who want to settle westward. And they don't appreciate the fact that England's not letting them do that. So they don't leave. Many colonists who already were in the Ohio Valley, in fact, even George Washington had already bought lots of land in the Ohio Valley, and he's not going to give it up. He doesn't sell it. A lot of colonists never leave the Ohio Valley. So there's tremendous disobedience among the colonists who were supposed to have left the Ohio Valley, according to the Proclamation of 1763. So England is going to start to resent the colonists, just like the colonists start to resent them for setting that boundary on them. This resentment is going to lead to kind of an end of salutary neglect, where England was letting the colonists do whatever they wanted as long as they played nice in that whole mercantile system. England kind of feels like the colonists, the 13 English colonies, and their citizens are not playing nice anymore. So they're going to start tightening up on the colonies. In fact, they're also going to use the colonists as a way to make money back for the cost of the French and Indian War. So those taxes that England didn't always enforce, they're going to start enforcing them. That includes the Sugar Act. You already had the Proclamation as a way of controlling the colonists, and now you're going to get a new tax called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act that England kind of puts on the colonists is a tax on all paper products: wills, marriage licenses, playing cards, newspapers. So any paper, whether it's for entertainment purposes, whether it's legal documents, whether it's for informational, all of those papers are going to have a stamp on them, and those stamps are going to cost money. So the Stamp Act is going to kind of lead to more resentment among the colonists. You can kind of see it happening. They're already mad about the Proclamation. And now these stamps are going to stamp every piece of paper in the colonies, and that stamp is going to be taxed, and that money is going to go over to England. The colonists were not feeling that, so they're going to riot. They're going to boycott. They're going to petition to have any taxes that are not given to them by any representatives other than the ones they're voted for to be removed from the colonies. You see, the colonists had a system of government that was already established, and those local governments in the colonies that had been voted into office by the colonists, those governments, those assemblies, like the Virginia House of Burgesses, like the New York Assembly, in Massachusetts, even way back in 1620 with the Pilgrims, you had a contract, the Mayflower Compact, that was establishing the first sort of government. So England had let the colonies govern themselves for years, ever since kind of the first settlements in 1609 with Jamestown and 1620 with Plymouth. So the colonists were used to having their own taxes put upon them by their own governments. So when England decides they're actually going to enforce the taxes they used to have, plus add new taxes on the colonies following the French and Indian War, that's not going to sit well with the colonists. So again, going back to salutary neglect, England neglected to enforce taxes on the colonists. England let the colonies govern themselves. That's kind of ending after the French and Indian War. And the colonists did not feel like that was fair. It kind of felt like a parent who would let a child get away with whatever they wanted to for 13 years. And you guys are 13, 14 years old. Imagine you've been able to do whatever you want. And now your parents are like, nope, you're not going to be able to stay up as late as you want. You can't have your phone as often as you want. We're going to cut off all of those kind of privileges you used to have, and we're going to put restrictions on you. That's what the colonies felt like England was doing to them. After having taken advantage of salutary neglect for so long, now the colonies were like not allowed to settle in the Ohio Valley. They had to have these taxes, the stamp taxes. They were supposed to be funding for the English debt from the French and Indian War. They didn't appreciate that. And they also were going to have to deal with a new sugar tax that was going to come into place, where the Sugar Act is going to be updated by England, and the colonists were not going to be able to, what they did before was smuggle sugar into the colonies, even though there was a Sugar Act from 1733. But the colonists were no longer going to be able to smuggle sugar into the colonies with a new Sugar Act in 1764. So the colonists rebel against the Stamp Act. They're not happy about the Sugar Act and the Proclamation. And some of those acts of rebellion actually work. And England repeals, that's a word you're going to have to know, repeals the stamp taxes. So make sure you know the word mercantilism. Make sure you know the word salutary neglect and what it means. And also make sure you know what it means to repeal a tax. Repeal means to take away a law that you had. And England repealed the Stamp Act. Well, so that should be pretty good, right? England's going to sort of like relax their new taxation on the colonies. Well, at pretty much the same time they repealed the Stamp Act, they also included a declaratory act on the colonists where they declared that they could do any new taxes or new acts of parliament that the colonists were going to have to follow. So England kind of pulled like a sleight of hand there where they said, okay, we're going to remove the Stamp Act, but we're also going to kind of announce that we can declare any new acts of parliament, any new taxes on the colonies. And they did so. So England's going to follow along with a couple of more taxes, but first they're also going to realize that because of the rebellion and because of the kind of acts of resistance of the colonists on the new laws that England was placing on them, England was going to need a troop presence in the colonies to kind of maintain control and to maintain control of the colonists trying to cross the Appalachian Mountains. And all these British regulars in the colonies were resented by the colonists. Why do we have to have British troops here? The war's over. The French Indian War ended back in 1763, yet you still have British regulars patrolling up and down the streets of the 13 colonies. The colonists resented that, but England needed to fund that. They needed to pay for the troops that were going to be living in the colonies. They also needed to find places for troops to stay. And it was tradition kind of in Europe, if troops needed to march from point A to point B in an English town somewhere in England, that you would let your troops stay in the villagers' homes. That was just kind of a courtesy. You know how we support the troops here? Well, that was kind of how England felt the colonists should support the troops in the 13 colonies, which meant that they were going to have to provide living quarters in the homes of the colonists themselves when the troops needed a place to stay. So England placed a quartering act on the colonists. And not only were they going to have to provide the colonists with a place to stay, which was requested by General Gage, who was still in the colonies. General Gage is a pretty famous British general. He was part of the French Indian War. He's going to be in the 13 English colonies during the time of post-French Indian War occupation of the British regulars. And he's also going to be a participant in the American Revolution. But at this point, General Gage requests from Parliament a quartering act or some law that's going to force the colonists to allow British troops to stay in colonist houses. But Parliament goes a step further and says to the colonists, not only do you have to allow troops to stay in your houses, you also have to provide them with candles, with firing, which means like gunpowder and things like that, with bedding, with vinegar, with salt, with ale. So those are lots of demands on the colonists, and they weren't really feeling that either because they had just protested the Stamp Act. And now, especially New York was really particularly offended by the Quartering Act because lots of troops were landing in New York City and they were occupying New York as a colony. And so New York Assembly said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to fund the provisions that you're requiring to give to the troops whenever they're in the colonies. What if we have particular homeowners who run out of vinegar, who run out of salt? We're not going to just use our own government taxes in our own local assembly to pay for those requests that you just put upon the colonies with the Quartering Act. So that was another act that didn't sit well with the 13 English colonies, and it's followed by the Townshend Acts. So a man named Champagne Charlie, Charles Townshend, who was a member of Parliament in England, he had been kind of discussing among the parliamentary sessions how we make sure we're controlling the 13 colonies, and his particular idea was to add more troops to the colonies. We've had the Quartering Act. Let's throw more troops over to the 13 colonies and make sure that those English colonies are behaving. And so a response in Parliament is, how are you going to pay for those troops? We're already still in debt from the French Indian War. And Champagne Charlie, he says, make the colonists pay for it. Let's just have more taxes put on them. We have the Declaratory Act that you had back from when the Stamp Act was repealed. So let's just put some more taxes on the colonists. They are beholden to us, the mother country. So you have glass, paper, paint, tea, and lead. 5 new taxes on the 13 English colonies coming from the Townshend Act. And of course, that's not going to sit well with the colonies. You see a pattern here? Eventually, England decides we're going to go ahead and allow the colonists to get their way again, and we're going to repeal all of those taxes except one. Any guesses as to which of those taxes was not repealed from the Townshend Acts? Glass, paper, paint, tea, and lead. Tea, you guessed it. The tea was this one tax that was kept on the colonists after the Townshend Act. So unfortunately, the colonies did get those other 4 taxes repealed, but there's still a tax on tea. And tea, as you may guess, was something that both the British in England and the 13 English colonists drank a lot of. It's a traditional drink, obviously, as you know, of the British culture. And so tea was a commodity that was consumed a lot. And so to have a tax on tea really hit the colonies home. It hit them, pretty hard. Plus, you're going to have colonists who produce their own tea, and you're going to have tea that might be imported from, who knows, maybe the Netherlands, where Dutch tea might be imported to the colonies, or, of course, British tea might be imported. Well, that leads to the next act of Parliament. So the Tea Act is following the Townshend Acts, where the tea taxes were the only taxes that were kept after the 13 original colonists protested the Townshend Acts. Well, a new kind of tea act, which isn't a revenue-making act. It's not just like the other ones where they were trying to make money from the French Indian War with the Stamp Act and with money for funding new troops like the Townshend Acts. This time, the Tea Act was just a way to get money for one particular business in England, in fact, one particular company called the British East India Company, which was a trading company that imported and exported tea from England, and they were stuck with lots of extra tea that was not being exported out of England. It was sitting on the docks of England, all this extra tea that was kind of within the British East India Company. And England needed to figure out a way, because in this mercantile system, the economy is very closely tied with the government. See, the British government had a vested interest in making sure that certain companies did well. That's kind of how the mercantile system worked. So what they did was they decided they would artificially lower the prices of the British East India Company's tea and export it to the colonies, in effect creating monopoly on tea, where the colonists would only drink tea made by the British East India Company. So the colonists were not really falling for that. That's kind of another sleight of hand trick where, hey, we're still going to tax tea, but you know what we're going to do? We're going to lower the tea that's made by the British East India Company. Why don't you go ahead and drink that tea, because you'll help out our parent company over here in England. But the problem is the colonists had their own tea making going on in the colonies, and they would have been competing with the tea that was made by the British East India Company, and they're not going to go ahead and buy the British tea instead of buying their own colonial tea. Plus, they were importing Dutch tea from the Netherlands, and England was forcing that Dutch tea to stay taxed, but not the tea from the British East India Company. So that Tea Act is a little complicated. It's not so much taxing goods coming into the colonies. It's actually lowering the price of tea coming from a particular company in England, where England was trying to help that company succeed, and they were kind of struggling financially. So what did the colonists do? Because they've reacted to every other act, they protested and they boycotted to the Stamp Act, and those are 2 words you should know too as well. You protest. That's an act of resistance where you're trying to resist some law that is being placed upon you. Protest can be simply holding signs in the streets. It can be writing petitions to the government. And so the colonists were doing that after all of these taxes. They were doing that after the Stamp Act. They were doing it after the Townshend Act. And they got their way to some degree when some of those acts were repealed. Now, a boycott is a kind of resistance as well. It's not exactly the same as protesting in the streets or having marches or writing letters. A boycott is refusing to buy something that is produced by whatever company or whatever government is supporting whatever it is that they're trying to sell to you. So the colonists were boycotting all goods that they were being forced to pay taxes on throughout the Stamp Act and throughout the Townshend Acts. And when it comes to the Tea Act, they boycotted tea as well. In fact, they went one step further, and some of the tea that the British East India Company was trying to export to the colonies that sat on the docks of Boston Harbor, colonists decided to destroy it. Dump the tea from several ships, 3 ships that were sitting on the docks of Boston Harbor, that were staying there because at the time the royal governor of Massachusetts forced the ships to stay there, hoping that that tea would be sold because the royal governor was supporting the British efforts to support the British East India Company. So the ships were docked, and the ships were loaded with basically with 90,000 pounds of tea sitting in barrels on the 3 ships. And but the colonists, the actual citizens of Boston, were not allowing those ships to unload their tea. So it's kind of a little bit of a stalemate, and ends up with an act called the Boston Tea Party. And I don't mean to say act like act of parliament. I mean to say like almost an act of terrorism, where the Boston Tea Party decided to dress up in costumes as Mohawk Native Americans and then sneak onto ships, some of the members of a rebellious group called the Sons of Liberty, and dump the tea, hack into the barrels of tea with axes, and then open up the tea barrels so that like tea would come just sort of spurting out into the Boston Harbor, dumping barrel upon barrel, 90,000 pounds worth of tea, worth upwards of $1.3 million, $1.7 million in today's money. And so that cost a lot of money for the British East India Company. It's actually got the opposite effect of what they were trying to do by having the colonists buy their tea. And so the Boston Tea Party, that act of almost terrorism, of rebellion that was done by the Sons of Liberty, that's not going to sit well with the British government. In fact, they decided to punish the colony of Massachusetts, rather, by giving what is called by the colonists the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts were nicknamed that because they were intolerable, what England was trying to do to the colony of Massachusetts as punishment for the Boston Tea Party. So this final act that we're going to focus on, the Intolerable Acts, included 4 things. It included closing the Massachusetts Assembly and making sure that no elected officials by any colonial representatives were going to be in a position of government in Massachusetts. It also included sending more troops to Massachusetts to monitor the rebellious Massachusetts citizens. In fact, even quartering those troops, so a quartering act was a part of that. And also, if anyone that was an official, that was a British official, that perhaps committed a crime or suspected of a crime in Massachusetts, they would no longer be tried in the colony, but would be tried over in England. That's the third of the coercive acts, the Intolerable Acts.